The gunshot echoed across the desolate plains of Wyoming Territory, 1883, as Forrest Reed lowered his smoking revolver and watched the rattlesnake's lifeless body twitch in the dust. 5 years had passed since he'd buried Elizabeth beneath the old cottonwood tree, and still, the emptiness in his chest felt as raw as the day he'd thrown the first shovel of dirt over her pine box. Forrest holstered his weapon and continued his journey across the rugged landscape, a solitary figure against the vast, unforgiving wilderness that had become his only companion. The town of Silverwater appeared on the horizon like a mirage, a collection of weathered buildings that seemed to rise from the dust itself. Forrest guided his chestnut mare down the main street, past the saloon where piano music spilled into the afternoon air, past the general store where children played with hoops and sticks, until he reached the livery stable at the far end of town. "Afternoon," the stable boy called out as Forrest dismounted. "Need a stall for the night," Forrest nodded, handing over the reins and a coin. "Feed her well, she's carried me far." "Yes, sir, name's Tommy if you need anything else." Forrest simply tipped his hat and collected his saddlebags. At 32, he'd grown accustomed to saying little, doing what needed to be done, and moving on. That had been his way since Elizabeth died in childbirth along with their infant son. The fever had taken her quickly, leaving Forrest with nothing but a pair of graves and memories that haunted his dreams. The Silverwater Hotel stood 2 stories tall, its whitewashed exterior faded to a dusty gray. Inside, a middle-aged woman with graying hair looked up from her ledger. "Room for one," Forrest said, placing coins on the counter. "Just passing through?" she asked, sliding a key toward him. "Always, madam." She studied his face, noting the weathered lines and the shadow of grief that seemed to follow him like a faithful hound. "Room 4, upstairs on the right. Supper's at 6 in the dining room if you're interested." Forrest nodded his thanks and climbed the creaking stairs. The room was simple but clean: a bed, a washstand, a small window overlooking the street below. He placed his saddlebags on the bed and removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair streaked with premature gray. The mirror above the washstand reflected a man with hard eyes who looked older than his years. After washing away the dust of travel, Forrest made his way to the dining room. A few other travelers occupied the tables, but one woman sat alone by the window, her profile silhouetted against the setting sun. Something about her posture, the way she held herself with quiet dignity despite the simple calico dress, made him pause. She turned slightly, and Forrest caught a glimpse of her face's delicate features framed by honey-brown hair pulled back in a practical bun. What struck him most was the profound sadness in her eyes, a familiar sorrow he recognized all too well. The hotel proprietress approached him. "We've got stew tonight, Mr. Reed." "Forrest Reed?" "Well, Mr. Reed, would you like to be seated?" Forrest hesitated, his eyes still on the woman by the window. "Is she waiting for someone?" The proprietress glanced over. "Miss Blair Johnson? No, she dines alone, runs the millinery shop in town." She lowered her voice. "Lost her husband in a mining accident 2 years back. Never quite recovered, poor thing." Something in Forrest's chest tightened. Without fully understanding why, he said, "Would you mind asking if she'd care for company?" The proprietress raised an eyebrow but nodded and made her way to Miss Johnson's table. Forrest watched as they exchanged words, saw the woman's surprised glance in his direction, followed by a hesitant nod. When Forrest approached the table, he removed his hat. "Miss Johnson, Forrest Reed, I hope I'm not intruding." Blair Johnson studied him with cautious blue eyes. "Not at all, Mr. Reed, though I wonder why a stranger would seek my company." Forrest settled into the chair across from her. Sometimes a meal shared is easier than one eaten alone. A flicker of understanding passed between them. "You speak from experience, Mr. Reed." "I do." He offered nothing more, and she didn't press. Their meal arrived: bowls of steaming stew, fresh bread, and coffee. They ate in companionable silence for a time, the clinking of silverware mingling with the murmur of conversation from other tables. "Are you passing through Silverwater, Mr. Reed?" Blair finally asked. "That was the plan," Forrest replied. "I've been drifting since." He trailed off, uncertain why he felt compelled to share with this stranger what he rarely acknowledged even to himself. "Since you lost someone," Blair finished for him. When he looked up, surprised, she added softly, "I recognize the look." "My wife," Forrest admitted. "5 years ago, my husband," Blair responded. "The Silver Dream mine collapse." They fell silent again, but the air between them had changed, charged with shared understanding, the unspoken language of grief. "You find that it gets easier?" Blair asked suddenly. Forrest considered her question with the honesty it deserved. "No, but you get stronger at carrying it." She nodded, her eyes dropping to her half-eaten meal. "I've been wondering if I've been doing it wrong. Everyone says time heals, but—" "Time just passes," Forrest finished. "Healing is something else entirely." Blair looked up at him, and for the first time a ghost of a smile touched her lips. "That's the most sense anyone's made to me in 2 years." That small smile, fragile as a first spring blossom after a harsh winter, stirred something long dormant in Forrest's chest. The sensation was so unexpected that he nearly rose from his chair. Instead, he gripped his coffee cup tighter. "What brings you to these parts, Mr. Reed?" Blair asked, steering toward safer conversation. "I've been doing odd jobs, cattle drives, ranch work. I was a homesteader once, but after Elizabeth died." He shrugged. "Land didn't mean much anymore," Blair nodded. "Thomas and I had plans to open a general store once he'd saved enough from the mining. After he died, I used what money we had to start the millinery shop. I'd always had a knack for hats." She smoothed her napkin. "Sometimes I wonder if he'd be disappointed, seeing me settle for less than our dream." "I think he'd be proud," Forrest said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "It takes courage to build something new when the foundation you counted on is gone." Blair studied him, her eyes searching his face. "You're not what I expected when Mrs. Holloway said a cowboy wanted to join me for dinner. And what did you expect? Someone looking for?" She hesitated. "Well, not conversation about grief, that's certain," Forrest smiled slightly. "I've found most people aren't comfortable with those conversations. They prefer you to act as though the wound has healed, even when it's still bleeding." "Yes," Blair whispered. "Exactly that." The dining room had emptied around them, the hour growing late. "Mrs. Holloway approached with fresh coffee, a knowing look in her eyes that Forrest chose to ignore. "Your shop," he said after the proprietress had gone. "Would you show it to me tomorrow?" Blair looked surprised, then curious. "You have an interest in ladies' hats, Mr. Reed." "I have an interest in seeing something built from grief," he answered honestly. "Something that survived." Her eyes softened. "Then yes, I open at 9. The following morning dawned clear and cool. Forrest rose early, as was his habit, and walked the length of Silverwater's Main Street. The town was coming awake, shopkeepers sweeping boardwalks, the blacksmith already at his forge, a stagecoach being readied for its departure. It was a scene he'd witnessed in countless towns across the West. Yet this morning, Forrest found himself noticing details he might have overlooked before a child's laugh. The scent of fresh bread from the bakery, a pot of red geraniums brightening a windowsill. At 9 o'clock, he stood outside Johnson's Millinery. The storefront was modest but well kept, with a display window showcasing several hats arranged on wooden stands. Through the glass, he could see Blair arranging ribbons on a counter. She wore a simple blue dress that matched her eyes, her hair arranged more elaborately than the previous evening. The bell above the door announced his entrance. Blair looked up, and that same tentative smile from the night before appeared on her face. "Mr. Reed, good morning. Miss Johnson." He removed his hat, suddenly aware of how out of place he must look in her feminine domain with his weathered duster and trail-worn boots. "Welcome to my little shop," she said, gesturing around the room. Forrest took in the details, the hats displayed on shelves and stands, bolts of ribbon and lace, feathers and silk flowers organized in glass-fronted cabinets. A workbench stood in the corner with tools laid out precisely. "You made all these?" he asked, genuinely impressed by the craftsmanship evident in each creation. Blair nodded, a touch of pride entering her voice. "Every one. I designed them for the local ladies, but I've begun to receive orders from as far as Cheyenne." Forrest moved closer to examine a particularly elegant hat with a sweeping brim and tastefully arranged feathers. "This is fine work. That one's for Mrs. Prescott, the banker's wife, for church services." Blair came to stand beside him. "Though I doubt you came here to discuss the fashion preferences of Silverwaiter's society ladies." Forrest turned to face her. In the morning light streaming through the windows, he could see her more clearly than in the dim hotel dining room, the faint freckles across her nose, the strands of copper in her brown hair, the delicate line of her jaw. At perhaps 27 or 28, she was younger than he'd first thought, grief having added years to her appearance just as it had to his. "I came because I wanted to see you again," he admitted. "I haven't had a conversation like last night's in, well, perhaps ever." Blair's cheeks flushed slightly. It was unusual, wasn't it, to speak so openly with a stranger? "Sometimes a stranger is easier to talk to than those who think they know you," Forrest said. "Those who expect you to be as you were before." "Yes," Blair whispered. "Though in truth, I'm not sure I remember who I was before Thomas died." A customer entered the shop then, a young woman looking for a hat to match a new dress. Forrest stepped back, watching as Blair transformed into a professional shopkeeper, her manner warm and confident as she helped the customer select ribbons and trimmings. Her hands moved with practiced skill as she pinned samples to a hat form, showing how the finished piece would look. When the customer had gone, promising to return the following week, Blair turned back to Forrest with an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry for the interruption." "No need," he assured her. "I enjoyed watching you work. You have a gift for it." Blair touched a bolt of blue ribbon absently. "It saved me, I think, having something to focus on to create. Days when I could barely find the strength to rise from bed, I would remember a customer waiting for her hat, and somehow I would manage." Forrest understood perfectly. In the months after Elizabeth's death, it had been the livestock needing tending, the crops requiring harvest that had forced him to continue functioning. Until eventually, the pain of seeing the home they had built together had overwhelmed even those responsibilities, and he had sold everything to become the drifter he now was. "Would you care to take lunch with me?" Forrest asked suddenly. "If you can leave your shop." Blair hesitated, then nodded. "I usually close for an hour at midday. There's a cafe 2 doors down that serves decent pie." "Pie sounds perfect," Forrest said, realizing he meant it. Simple pleasures had long since lost their appeal, but standing in this sunny shop with Blair Johnson, he found himself looking forward to something as ordinary as apple pie. At noon, Blair hung a closed sign on her door, and they walked together to the cafe. Forrest was acutely conscious of her presence beside him, the rustle of her skirts, the light floral scent that surrounded her. They drew curious glances from townsfolk unaccustomed to seeing the widow Johnson in male company. "People will talk," Blair said quietly as they entered the cafe. "Does that concern you?" Forrest asked. She considered this as they were seated at a small table. "It should, I suppose. A respectable widow is expected to maintain certain proprieties." A hint of defiance entered her expression. "But I find I care less for such things than I once did." "Grief has a way of shifting priorities," Forrest observed. Their conversation flowed easily over lunch, moving beyond the shared experience of loss to discover other common ground. Both had grown up on farms, Forrest in Missouri, Blair in Kansas. Both loved books, though opportunities for reading were scarce in their frontier lives. Both had dreamed of seeing the ocean one day. "Thomas promised we would visit San Francisco after we'd established our store," Blair said, a wistful note in her voice. "Have you traveled much in your wandering?" Not as far west as California, Forrest admitted. Mostly between Colorado and Montana, working where work could be found. And where are you headed next? Blair asked, her eyes on her plate. Forrest had planned to move on the following day, continuing north to a ranch where he'd heard they needed experienced hands for the summer. But looking at Blair now, at the sunlight catching in her hair, at the quiet strength in her bearing, he found himself reluctant to follow that plan. "I'm not certain," he said truthfully. A week passed, then two. Forrest found reasons to stay in silver-waiter odd jobs at the livery, helping the blacksmith when his apprentice fell ill, repairing the hotel's leaking roof. Each evening, he would escort Blair home from her shop, sometimes stopping for dinner at the cafe, other times walking the quiet streets as twilight settled over the town. They spoke of their pasts, their losses, but increasingly of other things, books they had read, places they hoped to see, small daily occurrences that had made them smile. Forrest discovered that Blair had a dry wit that emerged when she was comfortable, that she could name every wildflower growing on the prairie surrounding Silverwater, that she hummed softly to herself when concentrating on a difficult piece of needlework. He found himself sharing stories he hadn't thought of in years, boyhood adventures, his early courtship of Elizabeth, dreams he'd once harbored of building a cattle ranch. On a Sunday afternoon in late April, they walked to the edge of town where a small creek cut through a meadow dotted with early spring flowers. Blair had brought a basket with bread, cheese, and apples. Forrest carried a blanket borrowed from Mrs. Holloway, who had taken to giving him knowing smiles whenever he entered the hotel. "This is my favorite spot," Blair said as they settled beneath a cottonwood tree whose leaves whispered in the gentle breeze. "I come here to sketch designs sometimes when the shop is quiet." Forrest leaned back against the tree trunk, watching as Blair arranged their simple meal on the blanket. The sunlight dappled her face through the leaves, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked truly at peace. "It suits you," he said. "This place." Blair glanced up at him with a smile that reached her eyes, a real smile, not the hesitant, fragile one he'd first seen in the hotel dining room. Something shifted in Forrest's chest at the sight, a sensation both painful and sweet. "Forrest," Blair said, her voice soft but steady as she handed him a slice of apple. "May I ask you something?" He nodded, taking the offered fruit. "Why have you stayed in Silverwater?" Truly, the question deserved honesty. Forrest looked out over the meadow, gathering his thoughts. "At first, I stayed because talking with you was the first time in 5 years I felt connected to another person. Then I stayed because I wanted to see if that feeling would fade." He turned to meet her eyes. "It hasn't." Blair's hand trembled slightly as she set down the knife she'd been using to cut cheese. "I've been afraid to name what's happening between us," she admitted. "As though speaking it might make it disappear, or make it more real," Forrest suggested gently. "Yes." She drew a deep breath. "After Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over, that I would live the rest of my days in that in-between state, not truly living, but going through the motions." "I know that state well," Forrest said. "I've been dwelling there since I buried Elizabeth under a tree not unlike this one." He gestured to the cottonwood above them. "Yet here we are," Blair said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Here we are," Forrest agreed. Cautiously, he reached across the blanket and took her hand in his. Her fingers were warm and slender, marked with small calluses from her needlework. They sat in silence, hands joined, as the creek burbled nearby and meadowlarks sang in the distance. The moment felt fragile, precious, a delicate bridge between their broken pasts and an uncertain future. "I keep waiting for the guilt," Blair confessed. "For feeling this way about someone who isn't Thomas." "I've felt it," Forrest admitted. "Not just guilt, but a kind of betrayal. As though by allowing myself to care for you, I'm leaving Elizabeth behind." Blair nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Does it help to know that I don't expect you to forget her, that I would never want you to?" "It does." Forrest's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "Just as I would never ask you to forget Thomas, they're part of who we are." "But perhaps," Blair said carefully. They don't have to be all that we are. Perhaps there's room for something new to grow. Forrest looked at their joined hands, then up at her face, the face that had become dear to him in ways he hadn't thought possible. I'd like to find out, he said simply. The spring days lengthened into summer. Forrest took a permanent position at the livery stable, his knowledge of horses making him a valuable addition. He rented a small cabin on the edge of town, spending his evenings repairing the roof and porch that had fallen into disrepair. The work felt good, purposeful in a way his drifting had not been. Blair's business thrived as summer brought weddings and social events that required new hats. She hired a young girl, Molly, to help in the shop, teaching her the basics of millinery. On Sundays, she and Forrest would take their now traditional picnic to the creek, sometimes reading aloud to each other from books borrowed from the schoolteacher's small library. They moved slowly, cautiously, both aware of the precious, fragile nature of what was growing between them. Their first kiss came on a warm evening in June, as fireflies danced in the twilight and the scent of wild roses filled the air. It was gentle, tentative, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been building for months. I never thought I'd feel this way again, Blair whispered against his shoulder afterward as they sat on the porch of her small house behind the millinery shop. Nor did I, Forrest admitted, his arm around her waist. For years I existed rather than lived. Now I find myself looking forward to each day, wondering what hat you'll be creating, what story you'll tell me over dinner. Blair looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the last light of sunset. Is it wrong that I'm happy? Sometimes I feel that by finding joy again, I'm somehow diminishing what Thomas and I shared. Forrest considered her question carefully. I've come to believe that love doesn't work that way. It's not finite like water in a well that can be drawn down. It's more like. He searched for the right words. Like the prairie after a fire, for a time everything seems dead beyond recovery. But eventually green shoots appear and soon the land is more vibrant than before. Blair's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled through them. That's beautiful, Forrest. And true, I think. As summer turned to autumn, Forrest found himself contemplating a future he had not dared imagine for years. The cabin he had been repairing began to feel like a home rather than merely a shelter. He added curtains at the windows made by Blair from fabric remnants from her shop, and built a bookshelf for the volumes they had begun to collect. One crisp October evening, as they walked back from the cafe, Blair said, "Mrs. Prescott asked me today if we had set a date." Forrest looked down at her, puzzled. A date, Blair's cheeks colored slightly, for our wedding. It seems the town has decided we are to be married. Forrest stopped walking, turning to face her in the middle of the quiet street. The setting sun gilded her hair with copper and gold, and her eyes reflected the deep blue of the twilight sky. In that moment, he saw with perfect clarity what he wanted not just for tomorrow or next month, but for all the days he had remaining. Would that be so terrible? He asked softly. If they were right, Blair's eyes widened. Forrest, are you? He took her hands in his. I had planned something more romantic, a proper proposal with a ring and perhaps fewer curious onlookers. He nodded toward the general store, where the shopkeeper was watching them through the window with undisguised interest. Blair laughed, the sound bright and clear in the evening air. I've never cared much for convention. Forrest smiled, then grew serious. Blair Johnson, I never expected to find love again after I buried my wife. I thought that part of my life was finished. But your strength, your kindness, your smile that came so rarely at first but now lights my days, you've shown me that it's possible to honor the past while still embracing the future. He squeezed her hands gently. Will you marry me? Tears spilled onto Blair's cheeks, but her smile was radiant. Yes, Forrest Reed, yes, I will marry you. He pulled her close, heedless of the townspeople who had gathered to witness this moment. As he held her, Forrest thought of Elizabeth, feeling not guilt but a gentle gratitude. She had taught him how to love, and in doing so, had prepared his heart for this unexpected second chance. They were married on a bright November day, with the aspens and cottonwoods flaming gold against the blue Wyoming sky. The entire town turned out for the celebration, which was held in the meadow by the creek where they had shared so many Sunday picnics. Blair wore a dress of deep blue silk, with a hat she had designed especially for the occasion, elegant yet simple, adorned with a single white feather. As they exchanged vows beneath the cottonwood tree, Forrest looked into Blair's eyes and saw not just his present, but his future reflected there, a future he had once thought forever closed to him. "I can live again," he whispered as he slipped the ring onto her finger. "Because of you, I can live." In the years that followed, their lives unfolded with joys and sorrows, as all lives do. The millinery shop expanded, becoming Johnson and Reed Fine Goods when they added a section for men's hats and accessories. Their cabin grew as well, with the addition of a proper parlor and eventually a nursery for their daughter, Hope, born 2 years after their wedding. On summer evenings, neighbors would often see the family walking to their special spot by the creek forest, carrying their daughter on his shoulders, Blair with a basket for their picnic, both of them pausing occasionally to point out a wildflower or a soaring hawk to the child. Sometimes, Forrest would stand at the edge of town, looking out at the vast Wyoming landscape that had once seemed as empty as his heart, and marvel at how completely his life had transformed. He still thought of Elizabeth, especially on quiet mornings when the light had a certain quality that reminded him of her smile. But those memories no longer brought only pain, they were woven now into the tapestry of his life, threads that had led him, ultimately, to Blair. And on winter nights, when snow blanketed Silverwater in pristine white, Forrest would sit by the fire in their cozy home, watching Blair as she stitched a new creation or read to their daughter. In those moments, his heart would fill with a quiet gratitude for this unexpected second chance, for the courage it had taken them both to open their wounded hearts, for the patient understanding they had shown each other, for the new life they had built together from the ashes of their grief. "What are you thinking?" Blair would sometimes ask, catching his thoughtful gaze, and Forrest would smile, reaching for her hand. "That I'm the luckiest man in Wyoming Territory," he would reply, "because I found you and your smile showed me how to live again."